قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today a very special, talented young lady, and I'm sure by now you're familiar with my appreciation for the talent amongst the youth. Anna Zoe Herr is a student and MA candidate at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and she is doing some fantastic research on an issue that should be at the heart of every single individual because it affects humankind across the board. There's no distinction. It's not about race, religion, or ethnicity. It affects all of us as humans. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, Anna, for being and making this time with me. Or shall I call you Zoe?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Zoe, I mean, you've come all the way from Humboldt. You're an exchange student at the University of Pretoria, and you're doing some fascinating research on climate change.
Yeah.
So you've combined this as a research topic in association with your passion, which is arts, photography, creativity, imagination. How did all this link together?
I think how that started for me is because I was able to go to a liberal arts college in the United States. And for me, that gave me the opportunity to study art and the humanities at the same time as studying sustainability. And then I was going to write my bachelor's, and I really wanted to do it on climate change and on how we can understand and encounter this calamity in a new way. But I found that the majority of discourse on climate change was always in the natural sciences, and that really wasn't my main passion. So I was trying to attempt to find the crossroads between literature and climate change. So I started this really big research project for 1 year, and I was reading different fictional accounts by Amitav Ghosh, for example, and by different authors from around the world, and how they talk about environmental and social issues at the same time, and whether, for example, a fictional book can have the ability to bring about political change in a society.
But that's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah.
Because, I mean, if you really look at political change ultimately, there's always resistance, and resistance comes in terms of the main, I think, political leaders, and of course, you know, I always say follow the money. So it's like, who benefits if you follow the money, and if you look at political leaders, who's backing them, who's funding them, and then of course the driving ideology that will come from there will be based on where the money comes from. And so it's ironical actually that you were studying in the liberal arts college in the US, and I mean the president at the moment is one of the greatest opposers of climate change or deniers of climate change. So how did you feel when you were sitting there and contemplating this, knowing the political circumstances around climate change?
That's such an interesting question, because Donald Trump actually started the official process to leave the climate Paris Agreement today. And I remember thinking through the same kind of questions. And actually, it was because I was in the US, in the most neoliberal space on earth, in a way, that my interest was sparked. What can resistance be like if it's not economical, if it's not political? Because that's how we usually think about it. We're thinking, okay, there's climate change, who's going to solve it? It's going to be people in the natural sciences, it's going to be people in technology, or politicians, or the economy. And that, I think, is another trick of neoliberal capitalist logic that tries to actually find a new area of accumulation and control. And I think we need to bring it back to the public and the commons, and to think about, okay, climate change affects everyone. It's a right for everyone to know who and how and why it happens, and to find out what can we really do individually and collectively. And I think it really shows climate change is a problem of communication and a problem of imagination. And those are things that really you need to locate in the social sciences and within collective imagination and discourse.
Of course, and the whole question of imagination then, it's about reimagining the concept as well. Climate change, I mean, it's an old concept. It feels like, okay, so the climate is changing, so what? But it's good to see that a few European countries have taken the initiative. I think New Zealand, the UK as well, have now changed the whole discourse to move from climate change to climate emergency, to talk about, that it's no longer something that it's a gradual process. We're actually in an emergency. It's like red lights, the red lights are flashing. Do you find that in terms of the concepts that are being used and the way in which the discussion is presented, in a way it's about, making the public almost non-interested in what the conversation is about, yet it is almost catastrophic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think how you call that is the framing of a subject, and the framing really is an issue of communication. So the way that we use words and the way those words convey feelings will always create a different response from the public. So that when the Guardian started saying, okay, we take climate change serious and we will have an extra section on it, and we will change the terminology of it as well, I was so excited because they really realized the communication part of it is the main part, because that's the bridge from the information to the public. And I'm still a little bit sad that politicians and especially institutions have not been able to follow the same kind of reasoning.
So did you find that when you were doing your bachelor's and now going into your master's and preparing for this, I'm sure you must have done some research across the various universities, etc. Do you find that this particular topic, the subject, is actually being taught, is being researched, is being discussed, or it's still very much a novice entity in terms of higher education?
Yes, I would say there are seedlings kind of everywhere. So I found different magazines, journals, and some programs on environmental humanities, and something that's called eco-criticism. So eco-criticism is literature review or literature criticism out of the perspective of nature, and looking at how does literature convey ideas of nature and how does that change the perspective on nature from the reader. And so that was really interesting to me. But generally, the programs that I found were relatively small. And even me being in a global studies program, which is totally, geared towards the social sciences, I keep being disappointed that we are not talking about environmental issues as social issues, because I think they're completely related. Social issues produce environmental issues. And yet, in such a prestigious program that is, saying we are super globally minded and very transparent, we're still not finding that alleyway to talk about environment in terms of social sciences.
So before we come to your actual thesis and the research and the work that you're doing, I just want to marry a little bit about the creativity of your personal life and your passion, etc., with the whole notion of sustainability. Tell us a little bit about your love for photography and for arts, etc. What have you done?
Wow. So in some ways, I think my life has been a very strange marriage in between my great love for literature, for the arts, and especially painting and photography, and then my love for research and the social sciences. And I still haven't completely found how they interlink. But so basically, I have done painting all my life, and I studied painting. And so I have worked as a photographer, and I've sold my paintings and had galleries. And I would say that the work that I've done has so far not intersected so much with my research interests. So the paintings that I do are so much more related to transcendentalism and questions I have regarding human life in general, whereas the research is much more geared towards how do we progress forward.
No, but I don't see a discrepancy between the two, because
No?
if it's about human questions, then certainly climate and nature is a human question.
Yes.
So it's certainly an intersection, perhaps on a different level, and maybe through your transcendental questions, you've come to the question of sustainability, because ultimately it affects your living and your existence, and where you are and who you are. because a large part of defining who we are is our relationship with nature. But we have to go to a break. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit of the photography that you have done. So we'll see you when we come back.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of my interview with Anna Zoe here. And she is an MA candidate at Humboldt University in Berlin. We're discussing climate change, sustainability, and of course it's all linked to the whole notion of creativity and reimagining, a very important concept in the decolonial discussions that we've had continuously since 2014. So Zoe, when you spoke about the paintings, I mean, these are oil paintings that you've done and they're really beautiful. I had the privilege of looking at some of them. But then in terms of choosing your subject, I mean, even for your painting or for photography, how do you then go about doing that?
Wow. I think my process has kind of been the same forever. I think it comes from first observation, and I'm just kind of living and going about my day. And then out of observation, specific questions emerge for me. And then I often start journaling about these questions that I have. So for example, what does it mean to truly surrender? What does it mean to surrender to life happening around you instead of always resisting? And that was a question for me for a really long time. Also because my dad passed on, and for me that was a really important time to ask those questions. And as soon as I have that question in my mind, I start painting, and it's kind of as if the painting starts answering the question for me. So
the
I feel like
imagination of the inside is actually talking, isn't it?
It is, yeah. In a really beautiful dialogue. It
tells a story.
Yeah.
It tells its own story.
Exactly.
But you said, I love what you said. You said that it's about, I'm just going about living, but it's not really just about going up living. It's a very conscious living, isn't it? It's an awareness. So for you to ask these questions, you're conscious of the particular moment or conscious of a particular place or a particular event. And in all of this consciousness, there's always a triggering of questions. So that again points to something else, and it's about alertness. Would you say you have to be alert, you have to be conscious, and you have to be perceptive in order to paint or to do photography?
Oh, 100%. Actually, my art teacher used to say, art is paying attention. And I in the beginning, I was like, what does that really mean? And over time, it has become so perfectly clear that you can't just live without really paying attention and being aware, because you are always in dialogue with everything around you, and wherever you go, there is an impact that you do, and to not be aware and to not question that.
Okay,
is,
so now I found
important.
the answer to your question on the link between photography and art and creativity and your research interest in sustainability, and that is because you've been taught to be aware. And if you were not aware, you would have never really focused on the issue of climate change, on sustainability, and the need to create something. So
wow, you are so cool.
Yeah. So coming now
so
to this whole discussion, and as you were speaking, it struck a chord as to why we have youth who are totally disengaged. It's because in the majority of studies today in basic education, we have removed the whole concept of art and creative expression or creativity. Even in the way in which, young children in kindergarten, in the junior schools, you see there's far much less time spent on drawing, on painting, etc. There's, and they've even removed much of physical activity, going out, playing in the gardens, etc. So it's all on a jungle gym. You're not really in a natural environment, or you're not taught to sit and just reflect, even reflecting. That's why yoga is such an amazing exercise, because it brings back to that entire thing of paying attention. I mean, just to be able to hear yourself breathing or to listen to your own rhythm and heartbeat is about paying attention, and that then expands everything. So now I can understand why there's such a struggle with people generally and with the youth also to get them alert and aware. But I mean, what is your understanding or your comment on Greta Thunberg, who's raised such tremendous, awareness about climate change, or climate emergency rather?
That's such a good question. I find her really inspiring. And to be honest, that took me a second. In the beginning, I was not so sure about it because I have been very adamant about the fact that in order to progress, we need hope. And Joanna Macy talks about active hope like a verb. It's not just something that someone else gives you, it's something that you live forward. And I think that there's such a paralysis in the population to move forward because it feels so overwhelming what climate change and the potential end of civilization, as The Guardian has called it, could mean to us. And I actually think that Greta Thunberg, as being this really young, brave woman, has galvanized a sense of hope in young people and therefore also in the older generations. And that is really what's moving us forward.
What has been really frustrating for me is to watch the criticism that's being leveled against her, especially by politicians and, of course, corporates. Corporates where, of course, the majority of resources are plundered. When you encounter such a thing, what do you feel? What is your reaction? And how would you give advice to young people to say, but you know what, and I always believe that the minute you're in the right course, and this is from my tradition now, in the Islamic tradition, that teaches you when you're in the path to social justice, when you're always speaking the truth, when you countering the hegemons, there will be tremendous resistance, and that resistance usually is ugly. So the first thing they do is to try and attack the messenger because they don't like the message. So they will look for ways to brand you down, or to destroy your personality or to pick on you. For young people dealing with that, it can be very difficult. What kind of example or advice would you give young people?
I think when you start looking at the history of capitalism or the history of imperialism, and you recognize all of those elements in today's time as well, it is nothing but expected that that would happen. So in a way, as soon as you start doing morally right steps and to really speak out for the right thing, there will be resistance. And exactly what you said, there are two ways. There's either the attack or the absorption of the context inside of the neoliberal discourse so that it just kind of disappears. And I think when you encounter resistance, maybe that's when you know you're on the right path. And then you just have to keep going.
And it's important for young people to take up this particular banner, right? Because it's going to affect them. They have to continue living on this planet for far longer than older people. I mean, our time is near expiry, but I mean, you've got an entire future to look forward to.
Yes, they are. I think they are taking it up because the older people that are supposedly mature and responsible are not doing that, even though they really shouldn't. And
yes. Everybody has to play a part.
Everybody has to
right across from young to old, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And yet I feel like there's something so frustrating about the fact that it's kids at the front lines, and that those that are supposedly responsible have not taken that torch and carried it forward. So that is still something that I'm just kind of sad about, but it's also, it really is just expected.
What you say actually resonates with what much of the students said during the Fees Must Fall protest. When the youth were out on the streets protesting, one of I think the greatest sadnesses that they felt, especially those who suffered tremendously under the violence of the state and the university, was the fact that the older people, their parents, the social workers, the unions, did not come out and support them. So what you're speaking about is exactly what young people are feeling across the board, and it goes much to what Henry Giraud speaks about in terms of the attack on the youth and neoliberalism, where actually a war is being waged on the youth and on poverty. And if you look at it, both are connected ultimately also to climate emergency, because what we experience in terms of poverty is very much related to what is happening in the climate, the destruction of the environment, exploitation of resources and exploitation of people. So as a young person, what are the main concepts that you have put together in your thesis, in your research? In what angle are you taking it?
I just kind of want to mention something that you just mentioned too before I'll jump into that. Yesterday I was reading a sentence by Homi Bhabha, and he talks about how the state of emergency is also the state of emergence. And I kind of really love how that fits into the fees must fall protest, but also into the climate emergency. Yeah, and in a way that also was one of the main points of my thesis, or still is. And so basically I'm looking at how can imagination be inspired and lifted and expanded through the means of the arts or humanities, and how can the social sciences and the natural sciences come together? And then how can resistance be effective? So those kind of are my main questions. And I'm still finding and navigating my way through that, but I find it extremely important in our time today when, according to the IPCC report, we only have around 8.5 years left before,
really?
Yeah.
Or before doomsday.
Before the doomsday. And I just feel like it's irresponsible if the social sciences and the humanities exclude this discourse that they are actually part of. And the social sciences, post-Enlightenment, you see this idea of reason come through everything, and the idea that Durkheim said we can only analyze the social with the social, that divides, of course, the natural, meaning only the natural sciences can explain the natural. But we need to start bringing those together and really have this across all of the disciplines to talk about this.
So everything that you pointed to is actually what the whole discussion was also in terms of Fees Must Fall and the call for a decolonized university and a decolonized curriculum, precisely because of this, where colonized education and westernized education has put everything into particular disciplines, preventing this cross conversation. And when you prevent the cross conversation, you actually exacerbate the problems that we are finding, and you're not finding decent solutions. Like you said, it's a reabsorption, and then the discussion is just remolded, but it's the same entity. Nothing much has changed. And so exactly this, in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, this is what students were speaking about. Don't tell me at the start of my essay that I need to say what framework I'm following, or which am I following, a realist or idealist perspective, or I'm following this particular academic or this particular author, because there's so many conversations happening across, and we need to take all of this together, bring it together, and then find the most appropriate solution. So it's about moving, shifting from just binary disciplines to a more global picture in envisioning, and that's the whole concept of imagination that needs to come back into the curriculum. Yeah. So would you then say that we have a crisis, an epistemological crisis, an educational crisis, as part of the crisis in imagining climate emergency?
Totally. And I think that's the main crisis. The actual crisis is the fact that we experience climate crisis, but what we talk about is something different. And that the asymmetry of that will always produce conflict. And in order to really find solutions, we need to start aligning those, like to really recognize what is happening and how we think about it. Because still the discourse is so dominated by politics and economics that is influenced by neoliberal logic. And we need to start really building those bridges and maybe even reimagining completely new systems.
We're right at the end, Zoe. I would like you to just give me that quote again of Amitabh that you really enjoyed about the imagination, or what we spoke about right at the start.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the quote that really kind of guided me through the entire process is that Amitav Ghosh, an Indian writer who has become really famous on his novels on climate change and how that interacts with social justice, he said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this, that if we fail to solve the climate crisis, it will be a collective failure of imagination.
That's exactly where we are right now. A failure of imagination, because what we do is we keep reproducing hatred, and we reproduce destruction, and we reproduce war, and we reproduce conflict, while we're not moving towards something that is far more dynamic and sustainable, and that is love and peace and growth and well-being. So a final parting comment from you.
You know, I really love your show, and I know that your main topic also is decolonization, and I think that also fits perfectly into the discussion on climate change. There's such a big part that needs to be decolonized, and where the global south is being not being lifted up, but is being met and seen, and that the solutions really are not coming from the global north, as so often is being told, but it really needs to be a completely holistic solution process.
And there's much that we have to offer. So we need to find more humble academics like yourself from the global north in order to bring forth these particular conversations to the global north. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas and your research with us, and please keep that lamp burning, because it's a very important cause that needs much conversation and of course awareness. Thank you for your time, Zoe.
Thank you so much.
في أمان الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
ودين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في موت